Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Whiteboard History, where we talk anything and everything history. Today, going to be talking about the main factors that led to the start of what we now know as the Cold War. First off, the Cold War is called the Cold War because there was no direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union on the battlefield, but make no mistake, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost in this overarching conflict that completely dominated American life for some 30 years. So if we really want to get a good understanding of how history led to the Cold War, we have to go all the way back to World War I. World War I was a pretty devastating time for Russia. Not only were they handling the Eastern Front against the Germans by themselves, they had to deal with a revolution in the middle of the war which ultimately closed the Eastern Front altogether. Now, as many of you know, the Bolshevik Party assumed power during the Russian Revolution, which started what was known in the United States as Red Russia, or Communist Russia. And the United States actually sent aid to help the White Russian or the Tsarist faction against the Communists in the Civil War, but their efforts were futile and the Bolsheviks permanently took power in Russia. So the whole revolution thing going on in Russia really took them out of World War I and left them pretty devastated as a country. And although they were technically on the winning side of World War I, the country was far too weakened from their own civil war to make the leap to a world power or share in the rewards of victory. Fast forward to the end of World War II and we see a much different story. The Russians had suffered by far the most casualties during the war, but the Soviet Union was still in a position of power toward the end of the war. However, by this time, the United States and other Allied powers were not so fond of Mr. Stalin and communism, and some would ask, well, why then were they allies throughout World War II? And the answer to that is the Allies may not have liked the Soviet Union, and it may have been a toxic alliance, at least on the political level, but the United States and Allies needed the Soviet Union to occupy the Eastern Front, or they never would have been able to make progress in the West against Nazi Germany. The post-war negotiations are where we really begin to see the rift between communist Russia and the Western world, particularly the United States, take shape. The Western Allies were pretty set on an unconditional Nazi surrender after World War II. Woodrow Wilson supported a just peace for Germany at the end of World War I so that Germany would not be permanently crippled, but at the end of World War II, the Allies weren't having any of that conversation. The Russians, however, were not in favor of the unconditional surrender for the reason that the Soviets had already lost so many men, and they knew that terms of an unconditional surrender meant that Germany would fight to the last man. Also, Stalin and other Soviet leaders felt that Western allies, in particular the United States, had not done nearly enough before the D-Day invasion to dictate the terms of surrender for Nazi Germany. The Russians had taken on some 180 Nazi divisions throughout the war, and Stalin was obviously angered that it was the United States and Great Britain that were dictating the post-war negotiations. So what were these negotiations, and why did the Soviet Union feel so excluded from the talks? First off, the Western allies were opposed to the Soviets' proposed sphere of influence between them and Germany. Germany had attacked Russia twice, and the Soviets were adamant about a buffer zone to prevent yet another attack in the future. The Allies were obviously opposed to this, as it meant that Eastern Europe would be under the severe economic and political influence of a communist power. Next, the United States had immediately found a new enemy in communism following World War II. The Red Scare and McCarthyism had left communism public enemy number one in the United States, and the US did not trust the Soviets with their newfound nuclear technology. This upset the Soviets for obvious reasons, as they were the only Allied power not to share in the new technology found by the United States. Further, when Mussolini fell in Italy, Great Britain and the United States completely left the Soviet Union out of the settlement talks. The combination of those three factors, spheres of influence, nuclear weapons, and post-war settlements, created a rift between the Soviet Union and the United States that would issue in the Cold War era. The United States worked tirelessly to thwart the efforts of a pro-communist government in Greece to establish a democratic government, and that's basically what happened all over the world throughout the Cold War. These are the types of operations that sum up the Cold War. Clandestine operations to thwart communist governments in second to third world countries to prevent the spread of communism. Remember, history isn't always as black and white as we'd like it to be, and the history that we traditionally know should always be questioned. Whether or not there's a good side and bad side in this situation, it's the job of historians to empathize with both parties to understand their rationale and better interpret why things played out the way they did. This has been Whiteboard History. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.